My guest at this time is Dr. Paul Kengor, professor of political science at Grove City College. He's also a highly regarded Cold War scholar. He's the author, among other books, of Dupes, How America's Adversaries Have Manipulated Progressives for a Century, and The Politically Incorrect Guide to Communism. With lots of talk about the Green New Deal and President Trump condemning socialism in his State of the Union address, are today's Democrats really pushing socialism or something else? And what's the proper response? We'll discuss it all for the next several minutes. And Dr. Kengor, thanks for your time.
Hey, good to be with you again, Greg. Thanks.
Well, the people behind the Green New Deal keep saying the legislation is far different from the talking points that got released a number of days ago. But we know they want government-provided jobs, government-run health care, an end to fossil fuels in roughly a decade. So would you describe this agenda as socialist, or is it something else?
No, it's socialistic. And at the very least, it's about big government control. And I love the way they do this, right? They issue these talking points. They have everything all laid out. They're all excited and jazzed up about it. Then when everybody reacts in horror the way they should, then this is kind of like, well, we didn't really mean it, right, kind of thing. You should look at the legislation. Yeah. Look at that. That's a lot better, right? That's not as bad. But the legislation is bad, too. And what's so important about the talking points, Greg, and the things that were said about it by Ocasio-Cortez and the other champions of it, is that's where the passion is, right? That's where their hearts are. I mean, that's when you really saw their motivations, what drives them. Their broader thinking about this, and I wrote a piece on it for American Spectator called the Green Red Deal, and I want to see the roots of where this comes from. I went to the website of Green Party USA, which has had a Green New Deal layout outline for a long time. It's been up there for quite a while. And you go through there and you read that and you see that of the four planks in their Green New Deal, only one of them deals with like green resuscitation, reinvention. Three of the four planks are about things like the Economic Bill of Rights, abolishing the Electoral College, things that are political, economic, ideological, much more than they are environmental. So this is sort of classic leftist, progressive, socialistic, economic socialism more than it is green environmentalism.
Now, in many communist or socialist states over the last century, things change with a seizing of power often. We certainly saw it with the Bolsheviks in Russia turning into the Soviet Union, Mao in China, Pol Pot, Castro's Cuba, that sort of thing. This appears to be trying to massively change the system by using the existing system. So what examples can we look to either now or in the past as a precursor to what's happening here?
Well, that's right. And, the phrase that they use that we've used is watermelons, green on the outside, red on the inside, or pink on the inside. And in the 1980s, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, also Eastern Europe, communism in Eastern Europe, many of those old reds went green. They went into the environmental movement. Mikhail Gorbachev went into the environmental movement. He actually created something called the Green Cross International. I'm not making that up. The Green Cross International. That was his green version of the Red Cross, and it would be focused on environmentalism. The East German communists, many of them went into the German Green Party. And for the old communists and socialists, what the environmental movement allows them to do is control and regulate and limit people and resources. So if you failed to do that as a communist, especially under communist dictatorships, well, now under a democracy where people never actually elect communists, you can run through the Trojan horse of environmentalism. I mean, I actually consider myself, Greg, a true environmentalist. I live out in the country. My wife and kids make fun of the fact that I always refuse to cut down almost any tree, even if it's ready to fall in our house. My kids are like, "Dad, come on, look at the trees. You cut that down, you're gonna have another one in the place of it just as tall in a few years." But what's happened with many what's happened to the environmental movement is a lot of leftists and radical leftists have hijacked it in order to do what they really want to do: collectivize, redistribute, and control people and resources.
What's the magnet for them to look at the green movement and say, this is our vehicle?
Well, among other things, the beauty of it for them is that trees and frogs and rocks and birds can't tell them to go take a hike, right? But back in the days when, after 40 years of Soviet occupation, Poland in June 1989 had their first free and fair elections since they were promised at Yalta 44 years earlier. They open up 100 seats in the legislature to contested elections. The communists lost 100 out of 100 seats, 100 out of 100. And so for them to be able to go and represent trees and frogs and rocks and birds, those people can't tell them, hey, we're not going to vote for you. We don't want you to represent us. So it's kind of the perfect silent constituency for the far left.
What do you make of the fact that I don't know if it's totally mainstream in the Democratic Party, but it's pretty close. You could certainly make that argument with every major Democratic presidential candidate saying they essentially support the Green New Deal. So now that it's gotten this far, at least on the Democratic side of the aisle, is it too late to stop it, or are you encouraged by the fact that the reaction to the talking points was revulsion?
Yeah, I am encouraged by that, and I thought Mitch McConnell, Greg, calling for a vote on it was brilliant. And you saw how annoyed and agitated Elizabeth Warren was about that. But he's basically telling them, look, put your vote where your mouth is. There's no way you truly support this. You know that this is madness. And you look at the language, even in the legislation as well as the talking points, it's so categorical. It's the kind of thing that any experienced legislator knows. You never put that kind of language into actual legislation. You never say every and all, right? I mean, you don't say things like every building in the United States. You say things like, all buildings lacking in energy efficiency, right? Or for buildings lacking in energy efficiency. You don't say all. I think that's crazy. You don't use phrases like so as to make all air travel unnecessary. That's nuts. You say things like so as to lessen the need for air travel, all of which makes me wonder if maybe Elizabeth Warren's old pal, Ed Markey from Massachusetts didn't pull a sabotage here on the young Ocasio-Cortez. This really ought to be a career killer for her, and right now she's trying to escape this image of being the ditzy college girl who doesn't have enough experience, and then she goes and does something like this. I wonder if one of the candidates for 2020 or beyond 2024, an Elizabeth Warren type, wasn't privately encouraging Ocasio-Cortez to do this as a form of political suicide to get her out of the way. I mean, this real, and I know for liberals and millennials and so forth who are addicted like junkies to identity politics, who are only going to vote for Ocasio-Cortez because she's a woman and a minority. Let's be honest about this. They're going to vote for her no matter what. She could come out and say, my next proposal is going to call for Amtrak to employ 1 million illegal immigrants to lay track from California to Australia, and they would still vote for her, strictly because of identity politics. But the vast majority of normal Americans who have jobs are going to look at this and say, that is one of the craziest, most unrealistic things I've ever seen. That person can never be allowed anywhere near the Oval Office of the United States. Seriously, Greg, that ought to be a career killer for Ocasio-Cortez.
Instead, every presidential candidate is trying to agree with her.
Well, they were, and that's why what McConnell is calling for is brilliant, and he should stick to it. And they're agreeing with her because they know it's not going to get passed, right? And they know that they'll be able to use slippery language when the time comes. And it's like the old Richard Nixon adage, right? In the primary, run as far as you can to the left or the right, depending if you're a Republican or a Democrat. And then when you get the nomination, run as quickly as you can to the middle. So for right now, Kamala Harris and Cory Booker and everyone else, they're trying to out-Bernie one another, right, to get that Bernie Sanders far left moonbat vote that Bernie Sanders got. Bernie Sanders got 40% of Democratic primary votes in 2016. He got 13 million votes. Hillary got 17 million. Donald Trump got 14 million. Bernie almost got as many votes as Trump got, which was a record for Republicans. So a lot of them right now, I think, are happy to run to the left, but they better be really careful, because if they want to get in bed with things like the green-red deal, they're gonna regret it politically.
I'll be curious to see if that is the tactic, actually, because traditionally it certainly is to tack left or right to win the nomination and then run to the middle in the general. But if the main issue is I'm not Donald Trump, I'm wondering if the nominee will actually think they need to, and that could make it for an interesting dynamic in the final general election. But in our last couple of minutes here, Dr. Kengor, I want to get your reaction and your analysis of another aspect of the push towards socialism that you've also written about in another book called Takedown: From Communists to Progressives, How the Left Has Sabotaged Marriage and Family. Because one of the things that we almost always see in conjunction with communist regimes is atheism, militant atheism in North Korea, saw it in the Soviet Union, Cuba, on and on and on. And so, first of all, explain why atheism always seems to accompany socialism and communism, and how you think the push towards atheism is being orchestrated right now.
Well, that's a good question. And if people want a quick read on this, I know that this is going to sound a little esoteric, but Vladimir Lenin's October 1920 speech to the Young Communist League, and thanks to the miracle of the internet, you could just type in what I said and it'll pop up. And you go through there, and he's talking to the young people, who we call socialists throughout the thing, right? Socialists and communists. He defines socialism. He defines communism. He lays out what they believe and don't believe. And among other things, he says, we do not believe in God. And he makes very clear that to fundamentally transform, to abolish the old, to overthrow the old, they need to completely toss out the old order. And that includes rejecting everything from the Ten Commandments to the Beatitudes, from the Old Testament to the New Testament, and it means taking out religion. And so they always need to remove the old worldview that dominated people, so they can institute this entire new paradigm, this entire new way of thinking. And Lenin says throughout there, we have to teach communism, we have to teach socialism. And in order to do that, they've got to clear the deck. They've got to get rid of any competing influence or worldview that could get in the way of what they want to do with their socialist, progressive, or communist vision. And that's something that is endemic to the radical left. Now, I know if you're listening and you're like a social justice, Catholic, Protestant, Democrat, that doesn't work for you, right? You still want to integrate aspects of the Sermon on the Mount or whatever into your political, ideological thinking. But for the secular, radical left, that's part of how they operate. They are trying to break away completely from the Judeo-Christian framework and fundamentally reinvent everything from their views on marriage and family to unborn human life, right up until the moment of delivery, to right now, as we're seeing, even with gender, where you see Facebook now lists 71 different gender options. Any Christian, left or right, ought to be able to tell you God made them male and female, right? He didn't give 71 different options. So for part of the radical left, secular, atheistic project, religion is always in the way and always has to be removed from the equation for them in order for them to progress, as they put it.
Very interesting. Dr. Kengor, always good to talk to you, sir. Thanks very much for your time today.
Sure thing, Greg. Thanks.
Dr. Paul Kengor, professor of political science at Grove City College and a highly regarded Cold War scholar. He's also the author of Dupes, How America's Adversaries Have Manipulated Progressives for a Century. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Radio America.